Chicago, of course, the setting of the National Association for Black Journalists convention. And there was another tense moment there yesterday when former President Trump was asked about his running mate, J.D. Vance's comments about childless women.
He said the Democrats running the country are a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices they've made. And so they want to make the rest of the country miserable, too. He's not talking here about how great it is to be a parent. He's attacking what he says are the choices people are making to not have children. Did you know that he had these views about people who do not have children before you picked him to be your running mate? And do you agree with him?
No, I know this. He is very family-oriented, and he thinks family is a great thing. That doesn't mean he thinks that if you don't have a family, it's not. I know people with families. I know people with great families. I know people with very troubled families. And I also know people with no families. They didn't meet the right person. Things happen. You go through life, you don't meet the right person.
But he's not just talking about families here. He also says that people that don't have children should get less votes than those that do.
I'm just speaking for myself.
Is that your campaign
I think
position?
I'm speaking for him, too. He strongly believes in family. But I know people with great families. I know people with not great families that don't have a family. And the people without the family are far better. They're superior in many cases, okay?
Just minutes later, Trump then seemed to downplay the significance of his vice presidential pick.
I've always had great respect for him and for the other candidates, too. But I will say this, and I think this is well documented. Historically, the vice president, in terms of the election, does not have any impact. I mean, virtually no impact. You have 2 or 3 days where there's a lot of commotion as to who, like you're having it on the Democrat side, who it's going to be. And then that dies down, and it's all about the presidential pick. Virtually never has it mattered. Maybe Lyndon Johnson mattered for different reasons of what we're talking about, not for vote reasons, but for political reasons, other political reasons. But historically, the choice of a vice president makes no difference. You're voting for the president, and you can have a vice president who's outstanding in every way, and I think J.D. is. I think that all of them would have been. But you're not voting that way. You're voting for the president. You're voting for me. If you like me, I'm going to win. If you don't like me, I'm not going to win.
Joining us now, the host and creative director of MSNBC Live, Luke Rustert. Luke, good morning. As someone put it to me yesterday, Trump's efforts there to downplay the significance of his vice presidential pick sounds like probably what his aides have told him in recent days as he complains about the pick of J.D. Vance and all the bad headlines he's created where he's trying to say, no, boss, it doesn't matter. It's all about you, not about him. But clearly, Trump and his team on the defensive about this Vance pick, and it comes as Vice President Harris is about to select her own running mate.
Yeah, well, I don't think I've seen a less ringing endorsement of a vice presidential pick in recent modern presidential history, essentially saying, yeah, don't worry about him. I'm the guy on the ballot. That doesn't say like there's a lot of confidence that Donald Trump necessarily has in J.D. Vance. Look, Jonathan, I think J.D. Vance has been very problematic for Donald Trump on a number of levels, but perhaps no more so than his association with this Project 2025. And the fact that Donald Trump, someone who's very chameleon-like, something they talk about Kamala Harris being, never likes to really be pinned down on something, doesn't like to talk about policy, always likes to talk about the personal. J.D. Vance is so attached to the policy about what they would actually do if they were governing. One of the big stories here in Washington, D.C., close to Virginia, a state with a lot of federal workers, Project 2025, they want to fire all these civil servants. J.D. Vance is someone who's been in favor of that, essentially saying that anyone who has a government job, if they're a, quote, unelected bureaucrat, needs to be looked at. So in theory, you're having conversations here in D.C. and other places around the country with a lot of federal workers that go, hey, I worked for the FDA under 4 presidents, bipartisan, for 20, 25 years, and suddenly I get fired on day one of the Trump administration just because. So what J.D. Vance has done to Donald Trump is tied him down to a lot of policy that he doesn't like, not to mention on the personal front, which is deeply offensive to women. I mean, one of the things I always like to do is someone who's in and out of politics for the last few years is, all right, what cuts through to people who don't inhale this stuff like you and I do? I have gotten so many messages from young women that have said, wait, did he really say that? Did J.D. Vance really say that? So, no, I mean, if the job of the vice president is to be ready on day one and to not cause the ship to take on water, I think it's been an epic failure by J.D. Vance so far.
Yeah, the number one job of a vice presidential candidate is to do no harm. J.D. Vance doing harm. Jeremy, this reminds me, actually, this moment with of Trump downplaying Vance's significance reminds me of some of the reporting you have in your book. Because when Vance was picked, there's a sense that Trump was trying to say, oh, this is the MAGA heir apparent. And that may sort of be true. But Trump doesn't really care about the Republican Party. He cares about the MAGA brand, but he doesn't care about the Republican Party. He doesn't care if it's down ballot victories. He doesn't care about setting up for future success. He just cares about himself.
That's exactly right. And it's why he denounced, I think, Project 2025 in the strong language that he did, even though there may be policy prescriptions in that are farther to the right than he is. It's not his document, right? And everything always has to be about him, originate from him. And when I was reporting my book, I was talking to one of Trump's closest advisors, Steve Bannon, who said to me, and I quote him on the record saying this, do you think Trump cares about the next Republican who runs for president? No, he wants the next Republican presidential candidate to lose by 40 points because he wants to be able to say, only I could do this, Donald J. Trump. So I think that when you're looking at Vance and any kind of potential future he has in the Republican Party, you have to remember two things. One, the people closest to Trump often don't last very long, and they don't have political futures because they either end up in jail or disgraced or shoved out of the inner sanctum because they've somehow offended him. And that Trump is not interested in nurturing a successor for his movement because it's his movement in his eyes.
I love the idea that there's a kind of box you can tick. Do you want to end up in jail, or do you end up disgraced or just chucked out of the inner circle? That's what happens to so many of those people who hang around Trump for too long.